Under the desert night, Las Vegas glimmered like a jewel in the dark. The Strip stretched endlessly, its neon lights pulsing in shades of crimson, sapphire, and gold. From above, it looked like a river of fire winding through the quiet sands. High above that glowing river, Vista 88 stood like a lighthouse of luxury, perched on the 88th floor of one of the tallest towers in the city. Its windows wrapped around the building like crystal, offering a panoramic view of the sprawling city below. Inside, the restaurant breathed an air of hushed elegance, where every detail whispered of exclusivity. The chandeliers scattered soft reflections across the tables, casting a delicate glow on guests who spoke in low voices, their words almost drowned by the soft jazz that floated through the air. Waiters in tailored vests moved with quiet precision, their steps practiced and smooth, their faces composed behind polite smiles. The entire room felt as if it existed in a world apart, untouched by the chaos of the streets below. Among the staff was Samuel Rivera, a young man of 20, whose nervousness seemed to hum beneath his pressed uniform. His hands moved carefully, but there was a slight tremor in his fingers as he balanced the silver tray against his palm. He had only been working at Vista 88 for 3 nights, and already the pressure weighed heavily on his shoulders. Samuel wasn't here for the glamour or the view. He wasn't here to mingle with celebrities or overhear business deals whispered over rare wines. He was here because his father's medical bills had grown faster than their savings, and college tuition didn't wait for anyone. This job wasn't a stepping stone for Samuel. It was a lifeline. He kept his eyes down as he navigated the tables, weaving through the maze of chairs and pristine white tablecloths. He focused on his breathing, steadying himself with every step, determined not to falter in front of these guests who spent more on a single dinner than he made in a month. He could feel their glances as he passed, sharp and unspoken judging, everything from the way he walked to the way he held the tray. The restaurant, though calm, had an energy that pressed in from all sides. The guests were used to being served with perfection. Mistakes weren't just frowned upon here. They were quietly noted, tucked away like a mark against your name. Samuel knew this well. He had seen another waiter dismissed on his very first night for missing a table's drink order. Outside the windows, the city glowed brighter as the evening deepened. The fountains below danced in time with music, their jets of water catching the colored lights. In the distance, the giant Ferris wheel spun slowly, its passengers unaware of the lives unfolding far above them. Samuel's heart thudded in his chest as he approached a table near the edge of the restaurant. His tray was heavy with glasses, their contents shimmering under the soft lights. He moved carefully, aware of every step, every breath, every pair of eyes that might be watching. He didn't notice the small shift of a chair nearby. He didn't see the sharp movement that would send his world tipping. Not yet, but the night was waiting, watching, and something was about to happen that would change everything. Some nights begin quietly wrapped in silk and candlelight, hiding their secrets beneath soft music and polite conversation. But even in the highest rooms, even in places that seem untouched by the noise below, some stories find their way to the surface. This was going to be one of those nights. Rex Donovan didn't just enter a room. He overtook it. He walked like every floor belonged to him, with broad shoulders pushing through the air, his head held high, and his steps loud and certain. He wasn't dressed for subtlety. His tailored suit shimmered under the low lights, sharp enough to cut through conversations. A thick gold watch clung to his wrist, glinting every time he lifted his glass to drink. Around him, his entourage laughed too loudly at his jokes, hanging on every exaggerated word. They leaned in, nodded, often their smiles wide and eager. They weren't friends. They were satellites orbiting his ego, feeding it with constant attention. Rex's voice filled the restaurant, overpowering the soft music and quiet hum of conversation. He spoke in bold declarations, each story bigger than the last, as if every ear in the room owed him their attention. His words boomed, laced with arrogance and a polished edge sharpened by years in the spotlight. He waved his hands as he talked, drawing eyes, whether they wanted to look or not. His stories always circled back to himself, to his fights, to his victories, to the money he made, and the opponents he crushed. He wasn't just talking to his table. He was performing for the entire restaurant. Across the room, Kara Simmons sat at her table near the window, her phone propped up beside her cocktail. She had perfected the art of appearing casually glamorous. Her fingers moved quickly over her phone, adjusting the angle of the live stream, keeping herself centered in the shot with the city lights glowing behind her. Her followers watched in real time as she narrated her night, sprinkling in comments about the food, the view, and the occasional hint of drama. She knew how to spot potential. Her gaze flicked toward Rex, studying him with sharp curiosity. She wasn't the only one watching. Samuel moved through the room carefully, trying to focus on his steps, but Rex's booming laughter kept pulling his attention. Every burst of noise felt like a wave crashing through the restaurant, shaking the fragile calm Samuel worked so hard to maintain. Rex slapped the table, sending silverware rattling. He leaned back, laughing at his own joke, his voice thick with pride. He gestured to his entourage, feeding off their admiration, daring anyone nearby to challenge him. Samuel approached a nearby table, his tray steady but his chest tight. He avoided eye contact, slipping between chairs, his focus locked on his task. He could feel the pressure building with every step, his heart pounding louder than the jazz playing in the background. Just as he passed Rex's table, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. One of Rex's companions shifted suddenly, sending their chair jutting out into Samuel's path. He swerved, his body twisting to avoid the collision. The tray tipped. Time slowed as the glasses slid toward the edge, their contents shimmering under the lights. Samuel lunged to catch them, but the tray was too heavy, his hands too slow. A full glass of ice water tipped over, spilling down onto Rex's pristine shoes. The restaurant froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered inches from plates. All eyes turned toward the table where the accident had happened. Samuel stood frozen, the empty glass still in his hand, staring down at the water pooling around Rex's feet. Rex looked down slowly, as if savoring the moment, his face twisting from confusion to rage. His eyes flicked up, locking on Samuel, with a glare sharp enough to cut through steel. The room held its breath. Samuel's voice trembled as he scrambled for words, his face burning with panic. He stammered an apology, his hands already reaching for his towel, desperate to undo what had already been done. Rex didn't move. He let the moment stretch, feeding off the growing discomfort, letting the weight of his silence spread like smoke. Then he spoke, his voice low but sharp, dripping with disdain. He asked Samuel if he had any idea what those shoes cost, then answered himself with a number loud enough for everyone to hear. He mocked Samuel's monthly pay, his words slicing through the air with cruel precision. He stood slowly, rising to his full height, towering over Samuel. His shadow stretched across the table, swallowing the young waiter in darkness. He grabbed Samuel's collar with one hand, lifting him just enough to leave his feet unsteady. The room stayed silent, paralyzed by the unfolding scene. Rex's voice grew louder, filling the space with a dangerous edge. He spoke about respect, about consequences, about how mistakes were punished in his world. His entourage chuckled on cue, their laughter adding to the growing sense of menace. Phones appeared from Pocket's diners, recording the moment, their screens glowing like fireflies in the dim room. Kara's phone was already capturing it all. Her fingers steady as she zoomed in, her voice quiet as she narrated the drama for her viewers. She knew this was content gold. Samuel's face flushed deep red as he struggled to steady himself, his hands shaking as he tried to clean the water from Rex's shoes. He mumbled apologies, his words drowned by Rex's booming voice. Rex shoved Samuel back, sending him stumbling into another server, triggering a cascade of crashing glass that echoed through the room. The manager rushed over, whispering urgently to calm the scene, but Rex ignored him. His attention locked on Samuel. He taunted him again, his words cruel and deliberate, designed to draw laughs and deepen the humiliation. Some diners watched with fascination. Others looked away uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. Samuel's chest tightened, his breath shallow and quick, his heart pounding in his ears. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to escape the burning eyes that followed his every move. But there was nowhere to go. He stood there trapped in the center of the storm, his dignity slipping away with every second, while the restaurant watched it all unfold, some with pity, others with hunger for more. And somewhere in the corner something shifted, but Samuel couldn't see it yet. All he could feel was the weight of shame settling over him, heavy and suffocating, as the night carried him deeper into a moment he could not escape. The front door opened with a soft click, but almost no one noticed. The man who stepped inside didn't ask for attention. He carried himself with quiet ease, his movements smooth and measured as if every step had been taken before in some forgotten memory. He wore a simple button-down shirt, tucked into khaki slacks, the kind of outfit that blended in anywhere. His face was lined with the calm wisdom that comes from years of living without rushing. He moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going and why, unhurried by the pace of the world around him. The hostess greeted him with a polite but distracted smile, her eyes still flickering toward the corner where the tension simmered. He responded with a soft nod and a gentle glance that seemed to say he understood far more than she realized. She led him to a table by the window, near enough to watch but far enough to avoid being pulled into the unfolding scene. He sat with deliberate grace, his hands resting easily on the table. He didn't glance around or crane his neck to see the commotion. He simply observed, his gaze steady, taking in the details most others missed. His breathing remained even. His posture relaxed but alert, like a man who had spent his life knowing when to act and when to wait. As the restaurant's tension thickened, he watched with a quiet curiosity, his eyes settling on Samuel. He saw the trembling hands, the flushed cheeks, the weight of humiliation pressing down on the young man's shoulders. He saw the subtle shifts in Rex's body language, the way arrogance twisted into something more dangerous. Samuel stumbled past his table, too distracted by his own panic to notice the man seated nearby. A small piece of shattered glass skidded toward the man's feet. Without hesitation, he reached down and picked it up, his hand steady, as if handling something fragile. Samuel turned quickly, eyes wide with embarrassment, spotting the shard in the man's hand. He moved to take it, muttering an apology, but the man's gaze met his with a calm that slowed the moment. He handed the glass to Samuel with a quiet gesture, his voice low, and he even pointed out another piece just behind him. There was no judgment in his tone, no trace of condescension. Just a simple, steady presence that seemed to ground the space around them. For a brief second, Samuel felt the crushing weight of the room ease replaced by something softer. He nodded, mumbling a quick thank you before moving to collect the last fragment. He didn't realize until he walked away how much steadier his hands had become. Rex's voice filled the room again, louder now, his laughter sharp as he boasted to his table. He hadn't noticed the quiet man until that moment, but something about the interaction caught his eye. His gaze narrowed as he studied the figure seated by the window, his mind working through layers of recognition. He leaned toward one of his companions, muttering under his breath, asking if that was really who he thought it was. His friend glanced over, nodded subtly, and whispered back a name that carried weight in every corner of the room. Rex's amusement shifted into curiosity. He tilted his head, watching with a new edge in his eyes. He couldn't resist the urge to test boundaries, especially not when the room had already turned into his stage. The quiet man didn't react to the attention. He remained seated calmly, flipping through the menu, his expression unreadable but not indifferent. There was a stillness about him that unsettled those who were used to loud displays of power. Without saying much, the balance of the restaurant began to shift. Diners who had been focused on Rex's outburst now glanced toward the corner drawn by something they couldn't quite name. The air felt different, as if something larger than the moment was settling into place. The quiet man remained as he was untouched by the weight of the crowd's eyes. He wasn't there for a fight. He wasn't there for spectacle. But somehow, everyone knew that if he chose to stand, everything would change. And Rex, for all his bravado, could feel it too. Rex leaned back in his chair, his grin spreading slowly as he watched the quiet man near the window. He couldn't resist the pull. The opportunity to turn the night into his personal showcase was too tempting. He rose from his table, adjusting his jacket with a flourish, making sure all eyes followed him as he crossed the room. The restaurant hushed to the soft clinking of glasses and forks fading under the weight of expectation. Rex stopped at Chuck's table, looming over him with that same swagger he carried into every fight. His voice cut through the silence loud enough for everyone to hear. He questioned if the old man still had any fight left in him, or if all that remained were old stories and faded glory. Chuck looked up slowly, his gaze steady, his face calm. He didn't rush to respond. He let the quiet linger, letting Rex's words hang in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was even and firm. He talked about how some men outgrow the need to prove themselves. He said that wisdom wasn't earned through shouting or fists, but through restraint. Rex chuckled loudly, shaking his head as he glanced around the room, inviting others to join in his laughter. He mocked Chuck's words, calling them excuses from a man afraid to step into the ring again. He pressed harder, pushing Chuck, daring him to rise, daring him to prove his worth in front of everyone. The restaurant held its breath, caught in the pull of the confrontation. Eyes shifted between the two men waiting, wondering if the quiet man would finally stand. Chuck remained seated calm as ever, his hands resting loosely on the table. He looked at Rex without anger, without fear, only with quiet certainty. He said he had nothing to prove to anyone here. He reminded Rex that not all fights were worth having, especially not for the amusement of strangers holding up phones. But his words didn't soften Rex. They only fueled his desire to control the moment. Rex's voice grew louder, demanding a response, demanding a fight. He framed it as a test of pride, a chance for Chuck to prove the legends true. His words spilled over the room, dragging the diners into his challenge. He raised his arms, asking the crowd if they wanted to see the fight happen right there. Some voices murmured, some encouraged, and others looked away in discomfort. The air grew heavier, thick with tension and curiosity. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on Chuck's shoulders, but he didn't shift under it. Then Chuck spoke again, his words calm but firm. He agreed to the fight, but only under one condition. No cameras, no audience. Just the two of them, outside, away from the flashing screens and hungry eyes. Rex's face twisted, caught off guard by the simplicity of the offer. He tried to play it off laughing as he asked why they should hide from the crowd. Chuck's answer was simple. He said a real fight was never about showing off. It was about settling something personal quietly and with respect. The room fell into deeper silence, unsure how to react. Before Rex could respond, a new voice broke through. Samuel stepped forward, his face still pale but his voice stronger than anyone had heard before. He begged them not to fight over a spilled glass of water. He pleaded for the night to end without violence. All eyes turned to him, surprised by his courage, by the steady fear in his voice mixed with resolve. Rex sneered, brushing off the plea with a dismissive wave, but Chuck held up his hand, stopping him cold. Chuck looked at Samuel, then back at Rex. He added one more condition before the fight could happen. He said Rex needed to offer Samuel a sincere apology right there in front of everyone. Rex's face hardened, his pride kicking in as he scoffed at the demand. But Chuck's gaze never wavered. He spoke softly, reminding Rex that power wasn't about who could hit harder. It was about knowing when to admit you were wrong. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. The crowd watched, caught between anticipation and quiet awe as Rex stood frozen, wrestling with something far greater than the threat of fists. At that moment, the restaurant wasn't a place for fine dining anymore. It became something else entirely. A stage not for violence, but for character. A test not of muscle, but of humility. And everyone knew it. And they stepped outside into the quiet embrace of the night. The cool desert air wrapped around them, soft but sharp, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the nearby garden. The noise of the restaurant faded behind the glass doors, leaving only a few lingering guests who followed at a distance, unable to pull themselves away. The garden lights cast long shadows across the stone path. Rex stretched his neck from side to side, rolling his shoulders as he bounced on the balls of his feet. His stance was wide aggressive, his fists clenched tightly as if ready to shatter anything in his path. He grinned, his confidence dripping from every sharp breath. His body coiled like a spring muscles tense beneath his tailored shirt. He moved with the sharp energy of a man who believed speed and strength were all that mattered. Chuck remained still, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His posture was open, relaxed, without a hint of tension. He stood there quietly, not defensive, not provoking, simply waiting with the calm of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything. Rex lunged first, fast and fierce, his punch slicing through the air. He aimed for Chuck's head with a strike meant to end things quickly. Chuck stepped to the side, barely moving, letting the punch glide past without ever touching him. Rex spun around his feet fast, and sure, launching another attack aimed lower. This time, a sweeping kick meant to take Chuck off balance. Chuck shifted again, his body moving, as if he had seen the motion coming before it began. The kick missed, cutting through empty space. There was no force in Chuck's movements, no strain, no panic. He moved like wind, sliding through the branches of a tree, soft but impossible to catch. His steps were quiet, his face still calm. Rex's frustration began to build. He launched another series of punches faster, this time combinations honed from years in the cage. His fists sliced through the air with speed that should have overwhelmed any opponent. Chuck's body turned just enough to avoid every strike. His hands never even lifted to block. He simply wasn't there when the hits arrived. He moved at the last moment, slipping just beyond reach, leaving Rex to swing at shadows. The few people watching stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. They had come expecting a brawl, but what unfolded before them looked nothing like a fight. It was quiet, precise, almost like a dance. Rex growled under his breath, his chest rising and falling harder with every breath. He circled, trying to corner Chuck, trying to force him to stop, evading. His eyes narrowed, locked on his target. Chuck took a single step back, his gaze steady, his breathing smooth. He watched Rex carefully, not as an enemy, but almost as if observing a student working through a lesson. Rex rushed in again, throwing everything he had into a spinning kick aimed at Chuck's ribs. His foot carved through the air with fierce power, but again, Chuck was gone before it landed. He sidestepped with the grace of someone stepping off a train platform as if it were nothing more than a passing breeze. The more Rex attacked, the more he seemed to fall into his own trap. His movements grew sharper and more desperate, while Chuck stayed calm and collected, moving with the ease of water flowing downhill. It was clear now to anyone watching. This was not a contest of strength. It wasn't about who hit harder or moved faster. It was something else entirely, something deeper. Chuck never struck back. He never raised his voice. He simply moved, always one step ahead, always just beyond reach. The fight became something quiet and beautiful, a slow unraveling of aggression met with peace. The air seemed to change around them, the night growing still as if holding its breath. Even Rex's attacks began to lose their fire, his feet growing heavier, his punches slower under the weight of confusion and frustration. Chuck stood in the center of it all, untouched, unmoved, steady, as a mountain beneath the stars. He didn't fight with his fists. He fought with patience, with balance, with something that couldn't be seen but could be felt in every graceful step. And as Rex's breath grew ragged and his movements faltered, the lesson began to take hold. Rex's chest heaved, each breath sharp and heavy, his muscles burning from the weight of every failed strike. Sweat clung to his skin, his arms trembling as he circled unsure of what more he could throw at the man who had yet to even raise a hand against him. His mind raced caught between fury and disbelief, unsure how a fight could slip so far beyond his control. Chuck stood steady, not winded, not tense, just calm and centered. His eyes followed every movement, but there was no aggression in his gaze. He looked at Rex with something closer to patience, as if waiting for the right moment not to win but to teach. Rex lunged again, driven by pride more than strategy. His strike carried every ounce of frustration aimed to finally break the quiet man's stillness. Chuck moved once more, not fast, but just enough, letting Rex's own momentum carry him off balance. Then, with a motion so small it barely seemed to happen, Chuck placed a hand on Rex's shoulder. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't a block. It was soft, almost gentle, yet it froze Rex mid-step. Rex's body locked. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't pain that stopped him. It was the sudden, overwhelming clarity that he had been caught by something far greater than force. He stood there, unable to move, held in place by nothing but a quiet touch and the weight of his own exhaustion. Chuck's voice came low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the night. He told Rex that strength wasn't about who stood taller or hit harder. It was about knowing when enough was enough. He asked him plainly if he wanted to keep going or if he was ready to listen. Rex's heart pounded, but it wasn't from the fight anymore. It was from the words, the truth sinking deeper with each breath. He felt the eyes of those watching, but their stares didn't sting like before. The shame was no longer about losing. It was about finally seeing what he had been too proud to understand. He stood there, the air thick with his pride and his growing shame. His hands slowly lowered, his fists unclenching for the first time all night. His body softened, no longer tense with the need to prove anything. Chuck released his hand and stepped back, his face calm but watchful. He waited, giving Rex the space to choose, offering him dignity even now. Rex looked down, his voice rough, when it finally broke the quiet. He admitted that he had been wrong not just tonight, but for a long time. He said he had mistaken loudness for strength and aggression for respect. His words carried none of the bravado from before. He turned toward the door, toward the quiet eyes that still watched from inside the restaurant. He searched the faces until he found Samuel standing near the window, still wide-eyed from all he had seen. Rex's steps were slow but steady as he approached. He stopped just in front of Samuel, lowering his gaze, the weight of the night pressing on his shoulders. His apology came softly but clearly free from pride or performance. He said he was sorry for everything, for the words, for the shove, for making Samuel feel small just to feed his own pride. He asked for forgiveness, not with the tone of a man seeking an audience, but as one who had learned something he never knew he needed. The room remained still touched by something rare and raw. Samuel nodded, his words quiet but steady, accepting the apology without anger. It wasn't about the water anymore. It was about respect finally restored. Chuck stood in the background, watching his presence still calm and sure. He didn't need to speak. His part was done. The lesson had been passed not with fists, but with something far stronger. Rex turned once more to Chuck, nodding, with the kind of respect that couldn't be faked. There was no need for more words. Everything that mattered had already been said in the quiet between them. As the night settled back into its stillness, there was no trace of the fight left in the air. Only a deep, lingering peace, soft but powerful, as if the city itself had paused to listen. The crowd slowly drifted away, not in a rush, but moved by the weight of what they had witnessed. No one reached for their phones. No one scrambled for one last shot. They had seen something too sacred for spectacle. Rex walked away with his head lowered not in shame but in reflection, carrying the weight of what he now understood. Samuel returned to his duties, his shoulders lighter, his heart steadier, knowing he had been seen and heard, and Chuck, quiet as ever, simply turned toward the night slipping away as easily as he had arrived, leaving behind only the quiet proof that true strength never needs to raise its voice. Kara sat alone in her apartment, the glow of her laptop casting soft shadows across the room. The city lights outside blinked in the distance, but her eyes were fixed on the screen. She played the video back slowly, watching the scene unfold in a way she hadn't noticed in the moment. At first, her instincts stirred the old, familiar rush that came with knowing she had captured something big. She had been their phone, steady, recording every word, every movement. The faces in the restaurant told a different story now. They weren't just bystanders. They were people caught in something too raw for simple entertainment. She watched herself in the reflection of the glass, holding the phone, narrating the drama with excitement. Her voice sounded different now, hollow, somehow too eager to frame the moment for likes and shares. She paused the video, staring at the still image of Chuck standing calmly in the middle of the storm. There was something unsettling about how easily she had slipped into old habits. Her fingers hovered over the keys, ready to upload the clip, ready to watch the numbers climb. But a strange weight settled in her chest, stopping her from clicking. Her mind kept drifting back to the quiet strength she had witnessed. It hadn't been about the fight at all. It had been about dignity, about restraint, about something far deeper than a viral post could capture. She sat back, letting the moment stretch around her, remembering how Chuck had moved through the evening without seeking attention. He wasn't performing. He wasn't feeding off the crowd. He was simply there, steady and sure, standing up for respect without needing to raise his voice. Her hands moved slowly, opening a new document instead of the video app. She began typing, unsure at first what she wanted to say. The words came softly, not in the polished tone she usually used, but in something more honest. She wrote about what it felt like to witness real humility. She described how it had made her uncomfortable to see herself caught up in the excitement, realizing how often she had treated people as content rather than individuals. Her words carried no blame, only quiet reflection, as she admitted her own mistakes. By the time she finished, her eyes were damp, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of finally saying something real. She read it back, surprised by the way it sounded like her stripped of filters and performances. When she posted it, she didn't expect much. Her followers had come for glamorous shots and viral moments, not thoughtful reflections on dignity and respect, but within hours the responses began to pour in slower than usual, but far deeper. People shared their own quiet moments of witnessing kindness, of learning lessons from unexpected places. They told stories of grandparents, teachers, and strangers who had shaped their lives without ever asking for credit. Kara kept reading each comment, sinking deeper into her heart. She realized she had been chasing the wrong kind of connection all along. Her followers weren't looking for noise. They were looking for something honest, something steady. In the days that followed, she kept posting, but everything felt different. She stopped chasing shock value. She started sharing quieter stories, moments of kindness she had overlooked before, reflections on what it meant to carry respect into everyday life. Her audience shifted with her. Some drifted away uninterested in the new direction, but many more stayed drawn by the simple honesty of her words. She stopped worrying about numbers. She focused on the feeling of connection, the quiet thread that ran through every real story. Kara found herself walking through the city with new eyes, noticing the small acts that once seemed invisible. A door was held open for a stranger. A soft thank you was exchanged between two tired workers. The quiet, unglamorous gestures held a different kind of beauty. Her phone became a different tool, not for capturing drama, but for honoring it. She no longer needed to chase the next big thing. She had learned that the most powerful stories didn't need to shout. They just needed to be seen. Samuel returned to work a few days after the fight, unsure of what to expect. The restaurant looked the same, but something in the air felt different. People glanced his way with small nods, soft smiles, gestures that seemed to carry more weight than words. At first, it made him uneasy, unsure how to handle the sudden attention. He had spent so long trying to blend in to avoid notice, but now there was nowhere to hide. The same faces who once barely saw him now met his gaze with quiet respect. The first shift felt strange, every step through the dining room heavier under their watchful eyes. Patrons who had ignored him before now greeted him gently, sometimes pausing to ask how he was doing. It was kindness, not pity, and slowly it began to chip away at his unease. As the days passed, that kindness began to feel less like a spotlight and more like a steady hand. The kitchen staff treated him differently too, offering subtle encouragement in the way they spoke to him, as though they were seeing someone new. Even Chef D'Angelo's voice softened, his usual sharpness replaced by calm approval. Samuel started to notice his own changes, which were small at first, but growing. His hands no longer shook when he carried trays through crowded rooms. His voice, once barely above a whisper, grew steadier when he greeted tables. Confidence wasn't something that arrived all at once. It showed up in quiet moments when he least expected it. One evening, after the rush had settled, Detective Lawson approached him near the kitchen. She had been watching, her sharp eyes catching every subtle shift. Her words were simple, just an invitation to a community martial arts program she helped organize. At first, Samuel wasn't sure it was for him. He didn't see himself as someone who belonged in a place like that, but something about her calm tone made it hard to say no. She told him it wasn't about fighting. It was about learning how to carry yourself in the world. The following week, Samuel found himself standing outside the community center, nerves buzzing in his chest. The building looked unassuming, tucked between shops and houses, but inside voices echoed in steady rhythms. He took a deep breath and stepped through the doors. The room smelled faintly of sweat and worn leather, but it wasn't intimidating. People of all ages moved together, some focused and serious, others smiling as they worked through the drills. The instructor greeted him warmly, introducing him to the group without any fanfare. The first lesson felt awkward, his body unsure of the motions, his feet stumbling through the patterns. But no one laughed. The room carried an easy patience, allowing mistakes without judgment. He watched others closely, studying their calm focus, realizing that no one there had anything to prove. As the class went on, he started to feel the rhythm settle into him. The movements weren't about force. They were about balance, about breathing, about learning to stand steady no matter what came at you. He saw it in the instructor's calm smile, in the quiet concentration of every student. By the end of the session, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't thinking about spilled water or viral videos. He was focused on how his feet moved across the mat, how his breath settled into his chest. It was a different kind of strength, quiet but certain. Week after week, he kept coming back, drawn by the steady pace and the quiet encouragement. He no longer worried about how others saw him. He began to see himself differently, not as the clumsy waiter, but as someone learning how to stand tall. One evening, after class ended, Samuel stayed behind to help sweep the floor. The instructor thanked him, and then said something that stayed with him for days. He told him that martial arts wasn't about changing who you are. It was about discovering what had been there all along. Samuel walked home that night feeling lighter than he had in months. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, the path ahead didn't feel so uncertain. He wasn't just the kid who spilled water anymore. He was someone learning to move through the world with quiet strength. Rex faded from the public eye, quietly slipping away from interviews, commercials, and cameras that once followed his every step. His social media accounts, once filled with highlights and sponsorships, sat untouched. The silence felt strange at first, like an empty room after a party, but there was also something peaceful about it. He spent more time alone in his training space, a modest gym tucked away from the bright lights. The mirrors reflected a man stripped of titles and expectations. He started with the basics movements he had rushed through in the early days, steps that once seemed too simple to matter. The punches came slower now, each one measured and deliberate. He focused on his breathing, not on speed or power, but on control and clarity. It surprised him how hard it was to let go of the old habits, how deeply his need for applause had rooted itself in his muscles. There were moments when frustration returned, creeping in like an old injury. He missed the rush of victory, the thrill of a crowd chanting his name. But every time the longing rose, he reminded himself of that night, of the quiet strength he had witnessed. He remembered how Chuck had moved calm and effortless, untouched by the need to prove anything. That memory kept him grounded, pulling him back to the present. He no longer wanted to fight for attention. He wanted to fight for understanding. Training became something different. A conversation with himself rather than a performance. He moved through each form slowly, respecting the space, feeling the weight of every shift in balance. His body began to change, not in size or power, but in the way it carried itself. One evening, after a long session, he found a small envelope waiting on the bench near the door. There was no name on the front, just a familiar, steady handwriting inside. The note was simple, no long speech, just a quiet reminder. It said the road to mastery was long, but walking it alone often led to the clearest lessons. It encouraged him to keep practicing, not for trophies or headlines, but for the peace that came with knowing himself. The signature at the bottom was subtle, but unmistakable. Rex sat there for a long time, holding the paper in his hands, reading the words again and again. He didn't need a reply. He knew the message wasn't meant for the world to see. It was a private moment, meant only for him. Later that night, as the gym lights cast soft shadows across the walls, he stood in the center of the room. He bowed slow and deep, not to an opponent or an audience, but to the practice itself. The room was quiet, but his heart felt steady. He understood now that not every victory needed to be seen. Some were meant to be quiet, carried alone, tucked away like a seed waiting to grow. And as he straightened, he felt lighter, knowing this new path was his to walk one steady step at a time. Chuck returned home long after the noise of the city had faded behind him. His house sat at the edge of a quiet stretch of land, far from the lights that never seemed to sleep. The air smelled of sagebrush and soft earth, and the wind moved slowly through the open space. He settled into his usual chair on the back porch, a worn spot carved by years of quiet evenings. His wife brought him a cup of tea, her steps as familiar as the creak of the old wooden boards. They sat together in easy silence, the kind that needed no words. The sun stretched low across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and soft orange. Chuck watched the light shift each moment, slipping into the next without hurry. He felt the stillness settle around him, deeper than rest, fuller than sleep. He thought about the people he had crossed paths with in recent days. Faces flashed through his mind, each carrying their own struggles, their own lessons. He didn't dwell on the fight or the crowd that had watched so closely. He thought about the quiet afterward. In that quiet, he found something steady. He knew strength wasn't about the loudest voice or the sharpest punch. It wasn't something you had to show to others. It was something you carried quietly and without weight, like a steady heart. His wife reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. He smiled, grateful for the simple comfort, for the years that had softened everything sharp. They sat together as the last of the sunlight dipped below the hills, leaving the sky to the stars. The night grew cooler, but Chuck didn't move. He stayed there, watching the soft line of twilight stretch across the earth. In those moments, everything made sense in its own quiet way. He didn't need to prove anything. He had nothing to chase. The best lessons have always come in the quiet, in the spaces between noise, and in the calm after the storm. As the first stars appeared, he let his eyes rest on the sky, breathing in the peace that only came with time and patience. He knew there would always be new storms somewhere beyond the horizon, but tonight there was only calm. He closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze brush against his face, and smiled softly. Some journeys never needed to be shared. The best ones were simply lived one quiet sunset at a time.